My next guest argues that the absence of robust safeguards leave many African countries vulnerable to data manipulation. This could make the continent testing grounds for tech-enabled social engineering. For more on how machine learning technologies have the potential to override or even shape human judgment and political agency, we're joined by Karen Allen. She's a senior research advisor at the Institute of Security Studies Complex Threats in Africa program. Karen, good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, it's quite a complex field that you are exploring as you're watching some of the emerging threats that the continent could face. When you talk about this tech-enabled social engineering, in layman's terms, what are we really referencing here?
Well, in really simple terms, everything is very data-driven nowadays, isn't it? And what we're talking about really is protecting that data. And if we don't protect it, there is a danger that we effectively see the machines taking over rather than human judgment, whether it's choosing who we vote or choosing who we decide is worthy of support in society or who's worthy of exclusion, if you like. Those human judgments, there is a danger that those human judgments get overridden. Why do I say that? Because we're in a really powerful moment in time. We've got the growth of these mass capture technologies. What I mean by that is, say, centralized biometric databases where things like your iris, your DNA, your voice, your facial recognition characteristics, your unique biometric data is being captured on a very large scale, as well as some data that's captured when we walk, for example, through a shopping mall or through a neighborhood where we see CCTV cameras. So we've got mass data capture technologies taking off for very good reasons, actually, to try and cut down on things like identity theft, etc., which is a particularly big problem in this part of the world. But at the same time, we've got very, very powerful algorithms that are being developed, which when the two are put together, there is the danger that effectively the human loop is overridden. And the machines basically are able to take over and start processing information or be able to take data that can be cleverly micro-targeted to be able to manipulate how we feel in certain situations. It sounds like something out of sci-fi, but basically what I'm talking about, and it's research that's been done, some of it was done by myself on biometric systems in South Africa. Some of my colleagues from New York have been looking at the social engineering aspect. And what they've said is they've seen increasingly instances of micro-targeting of data, which we may supply very innocently. For example, we want to get our passport or we want to get our ID or driver's license. That data being effectively sold on and then used for nefarious purposes to possibly manipulate, tapping into our innermost fears at critical times, like, for example, elections, or even during COVID-19. We see sort of certain groups, there was a lot of xenophobic narratives going on social media. And those were being propelled by algorithms that effectively are able to amplify messages and in many ways shape the way people think.
I'm listening to you, Karen, and just some of the issues that you've touched on remind us again of why the Cambridge Analytica scandal was such a big deal, especially in the context of a period that leads up to election and even, in fact, the actual elections in and of themselves. What does the continent need to do in order to develop safeguards? And, you know, are we there yet in terms of the technology globally before we can even look at what Africa is getting right or what it's getting wrong?
Exactly. So what I'm saying at this point is this is not about being anti-tech. And there are really good reasons why we need those centralized biometric databases. And also there are good reasons why people who, for example, don't have an identity might have a better chance of actually getting an identity through some of this data logging, if you like. And it's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, what we're saying is we need to have safeguards in place. And what does that mean? Well, South Africa's got the Protection of Personal Information Act. Basically, it's a data act which enshrined in that are internationally recognized data principles about how our personal data, for example, is captured, how it's stored, how it can be reused, or rather that it shouldn't be reused, so, or repurposed. So if you surrender your data, for example, to get your passport, it doesn't get sold on to a private company that then uses the data for election micro-targeting purposes. So that's one thing that can be done. I think public awareness is also another thing, in terms of knowing that, you know, your data is, making sure that you read the fine print and you know how your data is being used. But also we have legislation coming on stream in South Africa to protect against cybercrime, because of course with so much data swilling around, it is possible, and technological people will be able to explain this far better than I can, it's possible to manipulate that data. Some people might have heard of deep fakes, where you're able to effectively manipulate data to create false realities. So, you know, that's why the legislation is so important. It's all good and well having a legislation. You need to have implementing, you need to give it teeth. Right, and we have an information regulator that's just come on stream. They're recruiting like crazy at the moment in South Africa to basically get that office properly populated. But we also need to have oversight mechanisms so that, for example, the algorithms that weed out who gets a benefit, for example, if they're applying for social grants, and who doesn't, based on a computer says yes or computer says no technology. What are the algorithms? What might be the built-in biases that exist there? So we need to, and a lot of these big data capture systems also need to be subject to oversight in the same way that so many other different government departments are subject to oversight. They can't be securitized. So we've seen in other settings, for example, the centralized biometric databases being used for security purposes to be able to sort of weed out who a state is particularly concerned about, whether it's someone who is a political challenger or someone who is considered a social deviant, to use that terrible phrase. But, you know, there's a lot of worries about, for example, in the LGBTQ community, whether people who surrender their data may then be targeted for political ends or for social exclusive ends. So that's why this is about awareness before the event actually happens.
What is the role that governments, and in particular big multinational corporations, have to play in this bid to, I suppose, walk a very fine line, which is oversight in some form of regulation without completely restricting the ability of just business being able to go on, and, you know, restricting people's freedom of speech or freedom of access to whatever information it is that they desire?
I think the key thing that businesses need to be aware of, and you know, a lot of them are, is being very, very clear about how the data that they capture is used, and that if it's used for a single purpose, it doesn't get retasked. That's thing number one. Another point that I think businesses need to be aware of is some of the supply chains of how the technology is actually acquired. So, for example, there are concerns about us becoming because so much of the data hardware and the sort of computerized kits, the cables, the cameras, the software that goes behind that are produced from outside of South Africa, and a lot of it comes from China. There is concern about data sovereignty. How much is that data protected from, you know, the camera, for example, the CCTV camera, right the way through to the box, the database, the hard drive where that data is stored. And so, you know, I think there needs to be an awareness. There needs to be a lot of businesses, you know, will now face fines if they do have serious data breaches. The world's taken quite a long time to wake up to how data is, you know, that many people are calling it the new oil, but it is an incredibly powerful commodity. And it's a powerful commodity because you are able to micro-target. Think of, for example, you know, big marketing companies that maybe might be food companies or it might be pharmaceuticals, able to target our particular needs. Now, in many ways, that might be a good thing because you might then not get inundated with adverts that's completely irrelevant to your life. But if you put that into the hands of someone who wants to manipulate the debate that goes around an election, that perhaps wants to withhold certain information, or wants to effectively stir the pot, tap into some existing sensibilities, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's religion, whether it's race, whether it's class. You know, this is a very powerful tool that's able to do that.
Curran Allen is with the Institute of Security Studies Complex Threats in Africa program. Thank you so much for coming onto the show tonight.